much, Georgina, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me and for having this conference. And it's extremely timely in view of the fact, of course, that there was no 5th World Conference on Women this year, as might have been hoped. And perhaps you'd want to think about preparing a synthesis or some kind of presentation with the results of this discussion for the September high-level meeting, head of state meeting, September 25th, that China is convening in New York as a replacement for a 5th World Conference. Anyway, I'm going to talk about global tensions and international debates on women's rights and relate this to the way gender's been mainstreamed in the UN. Just like Gita, who, by the way, touched on many of the things that I want to discuss about interstate relations, international relations around gender, I could have called this something like how, as a Democrat myself for such a long time, I can't stop worrying, but I did learn to love the value of instrumental arguments for policy attention. Anyway, let me just put all of your minds at ease and tell you that we've got nothing much to worry about, because in 15 years there's going to be gender equality. According to UN Women, in fact, they've got a vision of equity and equivalence, 50-50, by 2030. And more good news is that men are going to help us get there. According to #HeForShe, which is a campaign, as you know, that calls for men's engagement and commitment to women's rights without any particular challenge to their own dominance and authority. There's another campaign, #SheForSG, which aims to try to get a woman elected as the 9th Secretary General next year. I have to confess one of a number of mea culpas for this talk, that I came up with that silly hashtag as a parody of he-for-she, which I now regret for reasons I will tell you at the end. International space, as we all know, is extremely important and has been important for well over a century in advancing women's rights, providing the space to get around domestic patriarchies in an effort to appeal to universal norms or develop universal norms and invoke the moral authority of universal language on human rights. And feminists have used this language of liberal internationalism to considerable effect over the last century, to the point that Catherine Finmore and Martha Sicking, two international relations scholars, talk about a norm cascade, particularly when it comes to violence against women, that global thinking has changed profoundly on that. And that's in part because of alliances between norm entrepreneurs on the inside of international organizations and feminist organizations on the outside, working in and against states via transnational regimes. But of course, as came up in Gita's presentation this morning, and I will be, as I said, treading on some of that territory, there has been more than a little ambivalence and a mounting backlash, which is one of the things that I'll be discussing today. Stephen Krasner, another IR scholar, noted that many member states have accepted membership of the international regime and international human rights treaties, but often have been shocked and surprised at what that means for national sovereignty. But one of the areas that they choose to lash out against these international regimes quite sharply is on women's rights, very specifically. Also children to some extent, but the areas that that have been invoking the sort of greatest contempt by a number of member states are women's rights to physical security and voice, and property rights, and control of their own bodies and sexuality and sexual freedoms and reproductive freedoms. So as advocates and as feminists, we have to ask who is speaking for women, in what forums, and how. What arguments are being used. And I'm absolutely not advocating some kind of gender doctrinal policing, but I think it's extremely important for us to look at the conceptual and strategic framing of gendered arguments in policy environments. And the panel that I just attended, it came in very late, I'm sorry, before this session, of course, addressed this in donor agencies. So these are the kinds of questions that have to be asked How are priorities set? How are they framed in terms of the causes and remedies of inequalities between women and men, and inequalities, of course, between women? And how does this affect the feminist project of transformation in gender and social relations? And this, of course, comes back to the very important question, who needs sex when you can have gender, which was on the t-shirt that the IDS and Dev team wore going to Beijing 20 years ago. We were referring, of course, to the universal bracketing of the word gender by Honduras in the Platform for Action, spurred on by the Holy See, because, of course, gender was then and is still seen as a Trojan horse for bringing in the possibility that there can be more than two genders, and that there are many, many ways of expressing sexuality. So it's a term that's one of these red line words for conservative countries. Of course, now at 20 years on, when I look at this slogan, I think, well, sometimes sex would be good. But not quite as satisfying as gender, but anyway. So, a lot has changed since those 20 years, and of course one of the big, important, really significant developments has been the creation of a much stronger international custodian for women's rights, UN Women, an institution at the UN formed by the merger of the four tiny parts of the UN that had worked on gender up to that point. This happened in 2011, as you know. If I can say right now, there are many things we can say about it. Its limited mandate, its lack of resources, but it does possess one extraordinary power card, which is worth an awful lot, which is it was endowed the 14th seat on the Secretary General's Policy Committee. This is in its mandate. It was put there actually by the US. It was a very interesting addition. Many UN agencies do not sit in the almost weekly meetings of the Secretary General's Policy Committee. They are represented by other agencies. So for example, UNFPA is often represented by UNICEF, or FAO is not a directly represented agency. It would be represented by the UNDP. UN Women represents itself and women's interests on the Policy Committee. That's its job. So that means, in principle, it has access to all top decision-making processes. Every single announcement and decision technically should be vetted through UN Women. Now, that doesn't happen yet, but that's actually a very important institutional advantage. Just to say, there's also, rather paradoxically, a division within the UN in terms of the way gender is institutionalized. You have UN Women representing gender equality and women's empowerment, and as Gita noted, not women's rights. That was a point of contention. It's not in the title. But at the same time, an actually very powerful watchdog function was set up independently of a member state executive board structure, and that's the Office of the Secretary General's representative on sexual violence in conflict, which has a watchdog function and can convene the Security Council at any point on matters of women's protection. If you're a crowd of gender experts, you can immediately see the problem, a division between women as victims and women as leaders, a division between protection and participation. This stronger institutional presence at the UN actually is matched in many, many other contexts by gender ministries, gender commissions, or women's rights commissions. The ICC has a very strong gender function now. And we've moved from being what Helena Swanwick, the UK delegate to the League of Nations, called a rag bag of miseries and forlorn hopes, when she was assigned to the Fifth Committee, the League of Nations, which was assigned things like, I'm not going to find my notes now, but alcoholism, opium, women's rights, refugees. We've moved from that kind of rag bag of miseries to a very serious mainstream issue. So today I'm going to talk about three ongoing debates, and I'm really worried that I'm not going to have much time, so I'm going to be very superficial. Looking at the gender trouble that has kind of happened in three ongoing, very important policy debates at the UN. One is the role of the Security Council in advancing women's rights in peace and security, the General Assembly and its decisions on the post-2015 framework, and the recent discussions at the CSW and the breakdown of the CPD. And there's different concepts of gender being used in each of these. So in the Security Council, gender is synonymous for women and girls, the Via Emlo's phrase. and a protection and legal liability discourse is being used. In the post-2015 framework, I'm afraid that there is a lumping of gender as one type of inequality along with a long list of others. We're back to the rag bag of miseries. And then in CSW and CPD, we're seeing, in deference to opponents of women's rights, the use of gender as a synonym for women and girls, men and boys. So opponents trying to get very, very specific about what we're talking about and not opening room for interpretation. And what we're seeing emerge is actually a desire to preserve difference and inequality, frankly. Actually, before I get onto that, this parallel to this, and of course there's not enough time for me to develop this fully now, is the role of UN Women in all of these debates. And it's quite important to recognize that UN Women has a significant role. It drafts the 0 negotiating documents in each of these cases, which is an incredibly important power opportunity, which is neglected in my view, often. And it also lobbies member states to support a stronger feminist position, or it should. It does that at an international level, but it also does that at a local level. In every country in which it has an office, it should be lobbying the foreign ministry, the gender ministry, finance ministry, and also it supports women's organizations to do the same at local levels, and it supports women's organizations to come to New York and lobby internationally. In case I don't have time to get to my bottom line, let me just sketch it out now. We are seeing a palpable shift in international negotiations with much more assertive anti-equality and anti-rights, particularly voices, in the way that Gita described. And what I think we're seeing is our traditional defenders, progressive states, often taking their foot off the pedal in negotiations because of the association of women's rights with what is seen as and derided as a Western feminist project, a social change project. They're taking their foot off the pedal and not wanting to come out front on these issues. There are some very, very interesting new progressive actors emerging. Some Latin American countries, the Philippines quite strikingly, South Korea and Japan on some issues. But the defender that one would expect to be most vociferous, the European Union, is falling completely flat, and shockingly so. UN Women's presence ought to have mitigated this to some extent, but it is not, interestingly, performing the watchdog role that one might expect for reasons that I will speculate about. So, quite quickly. At the Security Council, those of you who work on women, peace, and security will know that there's been some extraordinary resolutions over the years. Lately, in the last 6 or 7 years, moving into a back and forth between resolutions demanding attention to sexual violence in conflict and resolutions demanding attention to women's leadership and participation in conflict prevention and resolution. A long and detailed story, but what's striking is if you look at Council actions in the last 2 years, the focus of Council instructions to countries in conflict has been almost exclusively on matters of sexual violence. The Council has retreated quite sharply from an interest in supporting women's participation, even equal participation in post-conflict elections. The focus is strongly on sexual violence, and it's easy to see why. Sexual violence is an international crime. It was a latecomer, of course, to international human rights regimes and especially prosecutions. But now it's firmly in there to the extent that now sanctions regimes routinely list sexual violence amongst the designation criteria for their attention, which is really a very significant achievement. And much as we can talk about horrible events in CAR, there actually is serious action to prevent sexual violence on the ground that is taking place, significant changes in the training and practices of peacekeepers and even in their equipment. So things are really happening to make a difference on the ground. Women's participation in leadership, on the other hand, is now openly dismissed as irrelevant to the Council's work. It's a matter that's seen as a developmental challenge, but not a security issue. Connections between levels of social violence and levels of domestic violence and conflict are dismissed. And this is very much being kind of pushed out of the Council. And these are the kinds of arguments that Council members use. Obviously, the framing of women as victims fits beautifully within the mindset of many council members. Russia charmingly talks about how the words women, peace, and security are harmonious because that's a natural thing, but it's unnatural to be talking about women in war, women in armed conflict, and so on. Every single year they come up with this stuff. In other words, all the advocacy around framing sexual violence as a method of warfare has actually ended up reinforcing a very essentialized perspective on gender in the Security Council. Now, a very uncomfortable issue to discuss, and I'm really nervous about raising it, is sexual violence against men and what that's done to the understanding of gender power relations as a driver of sexual violence. Sexual violence against men, as we know, is a significant phenomenon in warfare. We don't know how significant, but it's there for sure. Rashida Manjoo, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, has taken this up in her most recent report. She's quite concerned because it has enabled the discussions in the Council of Sexual Violence Against Men have been used as an excuse for taking gender power relations out of the discussion of sexual violence. It is a weapon just like cluster bombs. That's the way it's being treated. It can affect men just like it can affect women. Its resolution, solving it, is not about addressing structural issues and aiming for structural transformation. I'm afraid William Hague's special initiative on sexual violence, which honestly was very welcome, ended up doing the same thing but for a different reason. It's for this prosecutorial focus, the focus on scotching impunity and prosecutions, which isolate sexual violence as an individual criminal matter, as opposed to a broad structural issue. The post-2015 debates, which of course many of you work on very closely, have taken gender in a different direction. I mean, from one point of view, from the point of view of inequalities, the achievements are significant, I think, in the post-2015 debate, because the post-2015 debate deliberately moves past the limited focus on material conditions that the MDGs focused on. Anne Phillips's wonderful and so prescient comment on the MDGs 15 years ago was that, this is a retreat from social justice. It's an almost universal shift in social democratic politics where poverty supplants the problem of inequality, and what we're concerned about is establishing a humane minimum. And that's what the MDGs were about. That's been recognized now. And there is a focus on looking at end-state absolute inequalities, although not necessarily via seriously considering structural change and challenging neoliberal paradigms, as many people have said over the past day and a half. There is a standalone goal on gender, as we know, which is absent many of its initial components, which were more political and aimed to address political things, political power, women's positioning, such as looking at the nature and funding for and conditions of freedom for women's collective action, which is one of the most important components in the UN Women proposal on the standalone goal. Also missing is a tracker on women in local government, questions of looking at social reforms such as employment and food guarantees. And of course, this in italics is one of the targets which is most upsetting. Unpaid labor is there, but this merely calls for the recognition, hi there, of unpaid labor, as opposed to serious redistribution. Here, redistribution is contingent on whether or not it's nationally appropriate, which is one of the biggest disappointments of the gender goal. And of course, the idea of just redistributing within the household and family as opposed to state responsibility is also very disappointing. Now, UN Women is actually in an unfortunate way associated with this, the confusion. There was some initial confusion about whether or not there would be a standalone gender goal and what its nature would be and how intensively gender would be mainstreamed across the other goals. UN Women is actually ironically associated with this because in 2012, the Secretary General asked the UN to divide up into topic areas to start internal debates and formulation of targets and indicators. UN Women and UNDP chaired this Millennium Development and Post-20 SDG Task Force. And specifically UN Women and UNICEF co-chaired a subgroup on Inequalities in 2012, which issued its report in 2013, which you can see online. The recognition that gender was a universally cross-cutting inequality only came very late in the documents of that group. And the decision by UN Women to formulate a standalone goal and put it out there for debate only came after this whole process was over. So UN Women was actually in a position early on to say there's going to be a gender goal no matter what, and whether there is or not, there should be an internal group just addressing gender within the UN and deciding how it should appear within post-2015, and it turned down that opportunity. And the two senior directors responsible for this, I interviewed them before coming here, said that they were very proud of this. They said this was a strategic decision not to focus on what UN Women would be predicted to focus on. And that this would enhance UN Women's credibility with other UN entities, which is a shocking admission and a stunningly weak justification. First of all UN entities defend turf. That's what you do, and that's why you're hired. But secondly, not to defend your turf shows a confusing and, well, frankly, a disturbing ambivalence towards the gender agenda. To think that, I mean, we can go on in a discussion of this, but to think that a gender goal wouldn't have to be discussed is astounding, and that it could be slipped in by an inequalities goal is also astounding. So this was a huge strategic blunder that confused the debate. One last point about the post-2015 framework is, as you know, there's the concept of CBDR, which sounds like it should be a clothing store or something, common but differentiated responsibilities, which actually is one of the most powerful things about the post-2015 debate, because it brings North and South together in a sense of global community and shared responsibilities, and enables the post-2015 framework, of course, to address gender issues elsewhere. Not elsewhere, everywhere. Okay, so now, very quickly, CSW 2015. I was going to discuss CPD, but Gita covered that this morning. Now, CSW has become a negotiating backwater. It doesn't excite feminist movements domestically very much, except for those that are specialized in addressing these debates. This year, of course, was the 20th anniversary of Beijing, and more women's organizations and NGOs signed up for CSW than ever before. It was a mini Beijing revival. So unusually, there was a huge interest in the negotiating documents for CSW. However, a decision was taken by UN Women and member states to evade the increasingly toxic global negotiations that Gita described by pre-negotiating the outcome document, the declaration, the CSW declaration, which was drafted by UN Women. And in anticipation of the toxicity of the negotiations, a very, I have to say, anodyne and banal document was drafted. Nevertheless, it reiterated all the core principles of Beijing, including, above all, the idea of human rights as indivisible and the idea of state responsibility for preventing private abuses of power and private exercises of patriarchal abuse. So human rights was embedded firmly within this declaration. The declaration was negotiated in the weeks prior to the convening of CSW, the weeks prior to the arrival of national delegations. National delegations are really important because they're not just the foreign ministry, which is who ended up, frankly, negotiating this time. National delegations are ministries of women's affairs, health, education, and often huge delegations and contingents of civil society representatives. So they are actually often vibrantly feminist. And sometimes you see extraordinary things happening, as in CSW 2013 on the violence against women debates, when the Egyptian delegation came almost to blows with the Egyptian foreign ministry representative from the Egyptian ministry, where feminists in the Egyptian delegation told the foreign ministry representatives, no, we are not taking a conservative position, we're taking a progressive position. So it's very important to have the delegates there. It's an entry point for civil society as well. So by excluding that whole process, you exclude civil society and you make it a very government, tightly foreign ministry, not just government, foreign ministry controlled process. Several days before the declaration was issued on March 9th, women's movements got a hold of it and issued a statement condemning it as, of course, absolutely banal, but noting that during the negotiations a number of things have disappeared. For instance, mention of feminist organizations disappeared, mention of human rights defenders disappeared, mention of a long, detailed list that had been there of emerging challenges, including extremism, fundamentalisms, environmental challenges, etc. All of that disappeared. But most important, human rights disappeared for the first time from the body, the operational content of a CSW document. Disappeared. Conflict disappeared. That's been happening for many years now. But human rights disappeared, which was astounding. And what actually happened was in these closed negotiations in the weeks before CSW, an agreement was made that countries would drop their pet projects. Now, if you know how negotiations work, and I'm sure many of you do, countries, national delegations come with their strongest negotiating position. They come to the table with everything they want, put it on the table. In the back pocket, they know what they're going to surrender and what they're going to trade away. A very common trade, a very familiar trade, is that the development and overseas development resources support paragraph is roughly held hostage to a human rights paragraph. That's a normal delegation strategy. You don't agree the development paragraph until the human rights paragraph is agreed, then it all goes through. This year, the first step was that all delegations were asked to dump their pet projects to speed up, not delegations, I'm sorry, the mission representatives were asked to dump their pet projects. So off goes environment, fundamentalism, technology, etc., and off went human rights. Human rights were almost treated as a regional pet project. And the custodian of arguments on human rights was the EU delegation, which had sent a very inexperienced negotiator who worked hard to agree a strong development paragraph and development aid paragraph without getting parallel agreement on a human rights paragraph. The development paragraph was agreed in principle, and then the discussions were over. There was no space and no agreement on human rights. Now, this is important. It may seem insignificant. It is a negotiating backwater. The document could not be more anodyne. But it is a precedent. Just like in law, every single one of these agreements and resolutions is a precedent that then erodes clause by clause. It claws back part of the international women's rights agenda. What's happening is the former supportive states, and especially the EU, are sending very junior and inexperienced delegates to cut their negotiating teeth on agenda, while very experienced delegates, like the Iranian delegate for sure, are chomping away pieces of the agenda. Mainstreaming is a political and not a technical project, which it's been reduced to, and it can probably be well summarized by the banner that was brought to Beijing in 1995 by DEV and UN Women, breaking in and speaking out, a political process that's tough and involves contestation, and yes, that sound. At Heathrow, and Bridget, yes, that's how it came. Holding up the banner, breaking in, speaking out. So the notion is that it's always been an uncomfortable process. Mainstreaming, in our experience, has usually been working from the margins to the center, and a process of quite uncomfortable contestation. I know I have to stop very soon. What we're seeing now is something that Janet Haley described in a very tough analysis of mainstreaming, which I don't completely agree with at all. But she says that what you can have happen is what she calls governance feminism, where joining the mainstream means that you wipe off the feminist fingerprints of policy and you consolidate a particularistic, often very essentialist view of what gender is about. And I have problems with this because when you read it, it suggests that feminists are totally overdetermined, path-dependent, essentializing dupes, policy dopes, or that we've capitulated to the seductions of power. And I think some of this is true, but it's complicated, and I actually find Georgina's work quite helpful in thinking this through. Georgina, Fiona McKay, Louise Chappelle, and others, Martha Finmore, and so on, have worked on a new institutionalism that requires really deep analysis of how institutions work, how they function, how decisions are made, how things fall off the table, how decisions are not made. Yes, there are distinctive institutional legacies and path dependence which drive towards certain conclusions, but there's an awful lot of contestation that goes on that would not make the current situation with UN Women predictable, shouldn't make it predictable. And I think what all of these approaches need to look at, perhaps, is the fact that the current approach to mainstreaming UN Women is different from anything we've seen before. In the sense that, yes, like any other gender unit or women's unit, UN Women has no money, okay? We're far too, impoverished I shouldn't say we anymore. It is far too impoverished to complete its mandate. But it does have this foundational seat at the top table, which is so valuable, and it should be able to use that seat to make challenges to policy decisions that disadvantage women or exacerbate inequalities. The thing that we've overlooked is that the new leadership of UN Women, so UN Women was, as I said, created from this merger of previous entities, and then the imposition of a very steep three-tiered hierarchy of 9 new managers right on top of it, extremely steep hierarchy, almost none of whom have experience with the women's movement or even human rights, almost all of whom come from UNDP. And so they come from a completely different institution, and they're unused to being a policy outsider, derided and dismissed and disliked by policymakers. As one special representative of the Secretary General said to me once, "It's okay, go ahead, say what you have to say. I know eventually you're going to stop talking." And the new UN Women leaders aren't used to that experience of not being particularly welcome. They're used to being one of the boys and playing with them at the table. So this experience of contestation and looking for trouble and getting into trouble is alien. And one example, I think, that may perhaps illustrate this best is a very weird moment last October, on October 31st, when the Secretary General announced the composition of a high-level panel on peace operations. 14 members were announced with great fanfare, foreign ministers, former leaders of UN missions on peacekeeping, and that was 14 people, of which 3 were women. And this decision was immediately and strongly derided by Stephen Lewis, who is a longstanding critic of the Secretary General. He was also the former head of UN AIDS, and he pointed out that 3 out of 14 is a lesser number of women than in the peace operations panel that had been announced 15 years earlier. He said, "The timing of your announcement is a slap in the face to women working for peace the world over. In one stroke, you have repudiated the importance of gender equity in the appointment of high-level panels. In one stroke, you have declared to the world your view that there are no women to be found anywhere, and not in politics, academia, diplomacy, or somewhere else, if only I could find my notes, or among Nobel laureates who are qualified enough to satisfy the requirements of a panel on peace operations." Now, Secretary General said, "Oh, I forgot." So, forgetting is actually an institution. Georgina, Fiona, all of these other new institutionalists have described this. It is an institution. It's a practice. It's a very well-established practice. And it's the, "Oops, I forgot, sorry, I'll do better next time," which keeps happening over and over. Now, here's the problem. The composition of that panel would have been discussed at the policy committee, the Secretary General's policy committee. Should have been. So, there's only 2 possibilities, and they're both awful. 1, UN Women was there and didn't say anything. 2, it wasn't discussed in front of UN Women, which means that UN Women is not involved in these top decisions. It was a very important political decision. Either possibility is terrible, and no one is willing to tell me or has told anybody what really happened. Nobody really knows, because either one is so awful. So we're not there yet. We're at the table, but somehow we're not in the dark rooms making deals. Or if we are, we're not making the right deals for women. So that's rather worrying. So we have these challenges to combat the desire of top leaders to be one of the boys. And as others have said in other panels, we have got to build the visibility and leverage of feminist movements domestically and internationally. And especially, of course, for the countries that are the big hopes of women's movements in international negotiations. India, India is being watched carefully and is producing more and more disturbing statements, playing to a G77 gallery, rejecting rights arguments. South Africa, the same. Countries that are delivering, and in spades, the Philippines, but it's too tiny to actually build the kinds of coalitions necessary. Japan, South Korea, as I said, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and also the group of friends of LGBTI groups, which is very heavily dominated by Latin America. So just a few takeaways, and this is my last slide. The first word is the last. We have got to start getting in at the very front end and shaping the discussion and shaping the agenda, but once again, we've got to sort out this problem of the commitment of top leaders. We have to fill the vacuums and vacancies. CSW and CPD do take up a lot of time at the UN, and yet don't take up enough time of domestic women's movements and have to be more on their agenda, as well as other negotiating forums where we're not getting women's voice out loud enough. We do actually have to connect unambiguously to LGBTI issues and to sexuality issues. Gender has to be understood as foundationally related to issues of sexuality. Women's movements have to work more closely with their foreign policy establishments, or at least critique them more consistently. And a couple of more, much more work with smaller negotiating forums and regional institutions. It's very interesting that the Security Council, in spite of the problems that I've mentioned, because it's a smaller negotiating forum, interesting changes have been snuck in, little sleeper cells in resolutions, including one saying that abortion should be provided to victims of sexual violence, no matter what the domestic legal regime, which is a significant advance which has to be picked up. And then we either have to own it or debunk it. This impression that feminism is a Western feminist imposition has to be debunked by showing just how little money is spent on imposing Western feminism around the world, or let's own it and invest in it. Either way, go one way or the other, but that has to be done. We have to either expose the vacuum there or move into that space. And finally, we do need feminists at the top of these institutions. So I am resigning from the group of She for SG, and I'm going to form a new one, Feminist for SG. I don't care what gender. Thank you very much.